It is a profound honor and privilege to have you, Gil, and of course you, Natan Sharansky, on our webinar today. Natan, you of course have been a hero, not only to me, but to the entire Jewish people and to humanity as a whole. It was because of your incredible courage, together with that of many of your refusnik friends, and of course, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and your role model, Andrei Sakharov, that you were able to find the internal fault lines within the formidable Soviet armor, and were able to actually stare down the Iron Curtain and eventually see it destroyed. You spent 9 years in prison in Russia, 9 years in Israeli politics, and 9 years as head of the Jewish Agency. Gil, I think you are a rising star in the Jewish community. I've heard you talk before, and you're very articulate and eloquent. You've written 9 books. Each one of them is very clear, concise, and very, very readable. You're a scholar at McGill University, and you now live in Jerusalem with your wife and 4 children. We're also proud to be friends with your fantastic brother, Tevi, who will have speaking in another EMET webinar next week. Never Alone is by far one of the most compelling and most gripping books that I have ever read. It spans your life, Natan Sharansky, and decades of it. And it shows that you were a major player on the stage of some of the most dramatic events in recent Jewish history. First off, I want to ask you both, how did you meet, and what made you decide to collaborate on the book together? Gil?
I met Natan long before he met me, right? He certainly loomed large in our imagination. We had his name on our wrists and those bracelets, on our hearts. And the entire, Soviet Jewish movement was this movement that was really kind of a miracle. And those of us in the United States growing up in the 1960s, 70s, 80s who got involved, we didn't believe it would succeed. But we did it because we were nice people. And what's really interesting, one of the things I learned in working together with Natan in this book was that from the inside, they saw the rot. And it's an important reminder that from the outside, sometimes things look impossible, but from the inside, you can sometimes see the vulnerabilities. And also, there's a very few number of people who are really at the core of the movement who triggered this historic change. Anyway, we met informally in 2002, 2003. I was at McGill University fighting not just against anti-Zionism. I don't like when we're so negative, but also fighting to have a recommitment and a renewed understanding of Zionism. Mm-hmm. And I wrote this book called Why I'm a Zionist, and through that, Natan at the time was diaspora affairs minister and doing heroic work on the college campuses. We were in correspondence, then we worked on a few projects at the Jewish Agency, but the core of the collaboration began when I finished my last book, The Zionist Ideas. And I thought, who would be the ideal person to write the preface? And we had one of those funny meetings where I was at his Jewish Agency office asking him to write the preface. I had sent him the email months earlier, and now I know him, he'd kind of decided yes, and just assumed I knew. And he was asking me, as he was starting to think about retirement, if I would be co-author on his next book. So we're having this conversation, and I'm trying to go in one direction. He seems to be going in another direction. And fortunately, it worked out. He wrote the preface for the book, and we started this exciting 3-year adventure. Really, we call this a manifestoir or a memoir festo, because we're using Natan's extraordinary life to tell a broader story of the Jewish people, and a broader story of the need for dialogue, and a broader story to get out of our boxes and start connecting between liberalism and nationalism, between right and left, between Jews and diaspora and Jews in Israel. And so we use his structure of 999, the 9 years in Gulag, the 9 years in the Israeli government, and the 9 years in the Jewish Agency to tell this broader story of never alone. That wherever you are, when you're part of the Jewish people, you're never alone.
Right, right.
Well, and I will, look, I was, when I was already in the end of my 8 and then 9-year term in Jewish agency, there was all the time there was discussion whether Jews of Israel and Jews of diaspora, American Jews, are really diverging, are really in the process of divorce and mutual accusations that they betray our Jewish values or betray our Jewish country. And I thought that I have unique perspective from 3 different perspectives. You know, in the drawing, when you're looking at the same object from 3 directions, you can see the whole thing. And so looking at the unity of Jewish people, or the dialogue between the Jewish people and Israel from prison, where it was so easy to connect yourself or to feel connected with all the Jews of the world. And then continuing to watch it from the seat of Israeli minister, where of course it is much more difficult to feel yourself connected with everybody, and where you have really to present Israel to Jewish people and to make sure that interests of Jewish people are included at our government meetings. And then I looked at it from the position of Jewish agency, when you have to present Jewish people to the Israeli government and to make sure that Israel is used as a tool to strengthen Jewish identity. So looking from this perspective, I had no doubt that we Jews, with all our disagreements, have our joint desire to continue our journey in centuries. And so that's how I decided to look from these 3 different perspectives of the dialogue between ourselves and what it means for the world. And that's how I decided that it could be good to invite Gil the picture. And I'm very happy that we did it.
Yeah. Natan, you open the book with a description of your life in the former Soviet Union, and you very poignantly paint a picture of this repressive world of fair and doublethink. First of all, could you describe what was the most, what you described as the most difficult decision you ever made at that point?
Well, the most difficult decision I ever made was to stop this life of double thinker, of low Soviet citizen, of successful young scientist, but who in fact is has to censor every word and every action. And in the beginning, to say one simple phrase: I don't want to belong to this society. I want to leave this society. I want to go to Israel. The moment you say this phrase, all your life changes, and you'll lose your job, and that's the end of your career, and you'll be searched and interrogated and so on. But you become a free person. So that was the most difficult decision, to cross this line. All the rest was commentary.
Right. You seem, at the end of the book, you make the analogy between the atmosphere of fear and repression and double thinking that you had done as a young man in the Soviet Union and what's going on with American Jews and American college campuses today. Do you want to describe that a little bit?
It's not the end of the book. It's maybe one of the central points of the book. That really, as I described before in The Case for Democracy, which I then wrote with Ron Dermer, I divide the world on fair societies and free societies. And if you can go to the center of the town and speak freely your mind on whatever topic and not be afraid that you will be put in prison or punished in another way, you live in free society. It has its many problems, but it is free society. If you have such a fear to express your views, it's a fair society. And in fair society, the main phenomenon of all the fair societies, that's something in common between all dictatorships, is this phenomenon of doublethink. And then in the previous books, I described doublethink everywhere. In this book, in fact, we also went to the Arab Spring to show how in Arab countries, what meant the revolution, what meant the most difficult decision for the people, to cross the line between doublethink and dissident, and how immediately the situation changes. So, and then many years after this, traveling in the American universities, at the time of Second Intifada, one of the most difficult moments of Israeli struggle against wave of terror, when we were losing hundreds of people a month as victims of terror. And at the same time, of course, there was a lot of propaganda about how inhuman Israeli society is. And I'm traveling over universities, and there is a big campaign of boycotting Israel or supporting Israel. And when it was in Harvard, but then in other institutes, when some students say to me that they are very sympathetic to Israel, but because they know that their professors will not like it if they'll sign the letter on behalf of Israel. And so they decide to be silent for another year or two until their career is defined. I thought, my God, it's not in Moscow University, it's in Harvard. It's in the center of the free world. And so we analyze a lot in this book. We speak a lot about this, how dangerous doublethink, which is the sign of totalitarian regime, is the free world. Then it was about Jews. Today it's also about many others. There are polls which show that majority of Americans on the left and the right prefer not to speak publicly about their political views.
That's right.
Gil, you want to add something about it, because you
Gil has taught at McGill University in Canada for many years, so I think you know a great deal about this, Gil.
So first of all, I want to salute you, Sarah, and your organization, because you've been an indomitable force, both on Capitol Hill, but also in the universities, speaking truth. And it's so important. And look, I'm a case of arrested development. I love the university so much that I got there and I never left. I'm a graduate student, became a professor. So I take no joy in bashing the universities. But the university that I entered, the academic world that I wanted to be a part of, was a world of critical inquiry, a world of true lowercase L liberalism, where you learn from one another. And I have to say that as after the start of the Second Intifada, I don't even like to use that word because that's their word, the uprising really against, they say against the occupation, it was against the Oslo peace process, it was against Israel's attempts to make peace. And when I saw that at the university, we were immediately guilty, and especially in a Canadian university in Montreal, it was traumatic to me, because we got no credit for having tried. And Natan and I both have our critique of that attempt, but still, there was an attempt to try. We're watching Israelis be blown up on street corners and buses day by day, week by week, and everybody's blaming Israel. And as I started to speak out, it wasn't just that I did see the double thinkers, the people who were silent, the academics who would whisper to me, "I'm behind you," but not with me. We also, of course, saw the haters. And what really broke my heart was that at no point did any professor ever come up to me and say, "You know, Gil, I really disagree with what you said. Let's sit and talk." Instead, it was like I was involved in some kind of scandal, that I'd done some scandalous behavior by standing up for Israel. And people would say, "Oh, you're such a right-winger." And I would say, what makes me a right-winger? That I'm against terrorism? Or that I'm for open, free inquiry and speech? I said, I'll quote you. I'm an American historian. You want to quote liberals? You want to quote John Stuart Mill and Thomas Jefferson and Betty Friedan and Martin Luther King? They were all for Zionism. They were all, those in the later part, they were all for free speech. They were all for inquiry. What's going on in this university? And so it's not just a problem of Israel. It's not just a problem of Zionism. This is a rot in the university. We're seeing academic malpractice. Exactly. We're seeing people hijacking the podium, the holy sacred podium, which should be an opportunity for open inquiry, turning it into a political platform. And we're missing the opportunity to really teach our kids and expand them. And then they become the double thinkers of today.
That's exactly right. The most pernicious thing that's happening is this cancel culture, where there are certain ideas that are just taboo. You can't even bring them up. And, you know, I love what John Stuart Mill and Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, that the university is the marketplace of ideas. And when I went to school, it was this wonderful, heady experience to participate in the life of ideas. But now you can only talk about certain subjects, and it's to the loss of American society, because we need critical thinking skills. We need to be able to defend an unpopular point of view and find the evidence to back it up. And we need to understand how to debate, you know, and to treat your opponent with respect, not just, you know, make ad hominem attacks on them. So it's very, all right. So Natan, your liberation from the Soviet Union was directly linked to the pursuit of human rights. At EMET, we have a particular concern for the state of Israel, but we also feel that foreign policy has got to be linked to human rights. Unfortunately, right now, there are many people in the foreign policy world who are trying to de-link foreign policy to human rights. Can you elaborate a little bit on why you feel it's so important?
Well, for me, the connection back in the Soviet Union was obvious. I discovered my identity. I discovered being absolutely assimilated Soviet Jew and having only one value, physical survival and career success, and suffering from this double thing. Then I discovered the history of my people and wanted to be part of it. And then I discovered Jewish family and the state of Israel. And that what gave me strength to fight for my rights, for rights of other Jews, and then for the rights of other people. And for me to be spokesman of Jewish movement and spokesman of human rights movement was absolutely natural. One was supporting. More than this, the fact that so many people were united in this struggle, which then defeated Soviet Union, was because it was at the same time the struggle for human rights, the struggle for personal individual freedoms, and the struggle for the rights of people to live in accordance with their religion and with their identity. And the democratic dissidents were those who understood the weakness of this regime. And they were those who was accelerating this process of this regime falling apart. So we felt we are natural allies of the Western leaders. There were not many Western leaders who understood it. Of course, the contribution of President, who was the first to start speaking that must be part of the policy. He didn't do much. He brought this concept of human rights as the part of international conference. We were very encouraged, and of course we were disappointed that he didn't do much on this. But then when President Reagan said, it is evil empire, look, it is doomed by history. It keeps its people as slaves. We should never give legitimacy to the evil of communism. It was such great encouragement for us. So then later I was speaking and writing a lot about the importance of linkage of international policy to human rights, importance for the West in order not not to give up, not to strengthen the totalitarian regimes, and at the same time the West to have the real allies for defending the freedom and human rights of its citizens is democratic dissidence. I have to say, unfortunately, the last two administrations, administration of Obama and President Trump, in fact, disconnected fully the question of human rights from the question of American policy. President Obama believed in engagement with everybody, if it is the Iranian dictator or any other dictator, but engagement with the regime is more important than changing of the regimes. And President Trump, at some moment it seemed that he understands, some moment he simply said that Korean people love their dictator. It means that he was not really thinking about the real dynamics between dictators and their people and how the democratic dissidents can be your allies. So I think it's very unfortunate. I think the world became a much more dangerous place because of this dislinkage. Let's see what's...
Right. In 2000,
but I have no doubt that this linkage is a very important thing.
Right. My heart broke, and you wrote about it too, and Never Alone. In 2009, when there were millions of demonstrators on the streets of Tehran and all over Iran. You know, some even held up the signs, Obama, where are you? And we ignored them. Do you think that there is a possibility that the situation in Iran can be linked to human rights, just as we used to with
look, in my book, in the case of democracy, which was written in 2004, I was already speaking about Iranian people as the first candidate for democratic revolution, because Iran was an excellent illustration for my book when in one generation, it moved from the country of of true believers to the country of double thinkers. And so to double thinkers, and it's only the question of time and the moment when individuals, then tens of thousands, and then millions will cross this line of double think, and then revolution happens. In 2007, I had the conference in Prague together with Václav Havel, with dozens of democratic dissidents from all over the world. And everybody was speaking, and there were 3 or 4 Iranian dissidents, where we were speaking how ripe is the situation in Iran, where there are trade unions, women organizations, students organizations, who are all double thinkers, who are on the verge of crossing this line. So when this line was, they were crossing, when millions were really moving, all what was needed from the leaders of the free world to say that we are with you, not to send troops, but simply to express full solidarity, support, and sympathy. The fact that at that very moment, the leader of the free world says that engagement with the regime is more important for us than it's changing, that was a real betrayal. And that's what I said to one of his closest advisors. He said that that's real betrayal by free world of the Iranian revolution. Can it happen again? Of course it can happen. Will the free world behave differently? That I don't know. We really have to work hard for that.
If I could just add a historic note here. When Natan, first of all, in the 1980s, when Natan is in the Gulag, I'm a spoiled brat of history, is to use Leon Wieseltief's phrase. I'm at Harvard studying history. And when Ronald Reagan gives that speech and calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, and Natan and his buddies in the Gulag spread word about it through the toilet phones that they kind of had improvised to speak to one another from cell to cell, the dean of American historians at that time, Henry Steele Commager, called it the worst speech in American history. And that shows the gap, the moral gap that was going on. But we should emphasize, especially during this time when the United States is so riven by partisanship and polarization, the story of the linkage between human rights and foreign policy is a story from left-wingers, Democrats like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Henry Jackson, and right-wingers like Ronald Reagan. And that's an important value that we should understand, that when there's a way sometimes to find a platform on which left and right can agree, not everything has to become a political gap. I just actually spent today reading Obama's memoirs, and it's very interesting. He mentions the 2009 Iranian Green Revolution, but doesn't take any responsibility for his silence. And it's just sort of a passing notion. But he does acknowledge in his memoir that Samantha Power sometimes calls him out on his own tension between what he calls my youthful idealism and my more cynical or realistic side. And it's not, there's no easy formula, but we certainly hope that the incoming administration and the powers that be on Capitol Hill will figure out that maybe this is a red, white, and blue space. This isn't just a red place or a blue split space, where we can really have a conversation about how do we have a foreign policy that's realistic, that focuses on the stability of regimes who help us, but also has that idealistic dimension, which is so important, which is so much a part of the DNA of America, going back to George Washington's farewell address.
We're really fortunate in EMET. We've hired a wonderful dissident from Egypt, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, and he actually, unfortunately, was questioning early on the anti-Semitic propaganda that he had. Very early on, he wanted to be a jihadist, but then he went and he discovered through some independent searches of his own, he actually began to be like the Jewish people. He read Elie Wiesel and Martin Buber, and he was and unfortunately, he became a friend of an Israeli, and for that, he was imprisoned twice and tortured terribly. He did get political asylum under Barack Obama, which was the best thing President Obama's ever done. And we are working on some legislation to make sure that the Arab and Muslim governments understand that they're being watched. So the State Department has to report back to Congress every year in a yearly report about what happens to dissidents who speak out against the regime. And Natan, I remember in your book, The Case for Democracy, the litmus test was, can you stand in the middle of the town square and criticize the government? And so unfortunately, in the Muslim and Arab world, we have a long way to go there. Yeah. So
yes, but definitely we should not give up on this right in the free world. So it goes without saying that we have to help to our friends in Arab world. But what about our?
That's right. That's right. Especially on the college campuses where there's a tyranny of the left. It's horrible. So Natan, when you realized that Jerusalem was going to be divided and put on the negotiating table before Camp David in 2000, you resigned from Ehud Barak's cabinet. And then again, when you realized that Arik Sharon was going to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza, you also resigned, and you were right in terms of now looking at the incoming administration. Do you think they are going to start again to make sure that, you know, all peace runs through Ramallah? And are they going to use the incredibly generous offers that Ehud Barak and then Ehud Olmert made as launching points to negotiate with the Palestinians?
Well, we have to see. But first of all, I want to say that when I resigned twice, and when I was speaking against this, and before, when I was not in the government, but was speaking against Oslo Agreement, that was enough, of course, to characterize me as a ultra right-wing Israeli politician. I had, in all three cases, I wrote in articles, I wrote in my letters of resignation, in all my explanations, I wrote how it is bad for Palestinians, how it is bad for Jews, how it is bad for the state of democracy in the Middle East, and how there is no way that bringing Arafat and imposing him as corrupt dictator of Palestinians, we can make peace. And how this one-sided concessions by the division of Jerusalem, dividing in fact our identity, and or how helping to Hamas to create the biggest terrorist base in the Middle East by one-sided disengagement, how in fact we are perpetuating, helping to the war to continue, and how it has nothing to do with the real peace process. And in fact, everything what I was reading then, a warning, in my letters of resignation, in my article, everything, that's exactly what happened. Nevertheless, somehow it's felt if you were against those steps for peace, it means that you are on the right way. You don't have to be on the right or left in order to understand that only supporting civil society, only in the free dialogue between the people, with the Jews and Arabs, you can really have a serious peace process. By the way, I believe that now we are in the beginning of real peace process, not because Bahrain and Abu Dhabi are democracies, they are not, but because it's built on people-to-people relations. And I just now sat with the Bahrain King's Institute for Religious Tolerance, and we are discussing with them how together we will be fighting against anti-Zionism. It's strange to think that this Muslim country, or the special institute very important in that country, is ready together with us to fight anti-Zionism. Why? Because they want to build people-to-people relations with Israel. Now, by the way, I don't see anything bad if the administration, any administration will do efforts to resume negotiations between us and Palestinians. The bad thing is when the dictators who want to destroy us understand that they have a veto, that they have an opportunity to control all the relations of Israel with the Muslim world, and also with part of the free world, by dictating their conditions of negotiation. So it will be without preconditions. I'm fully for negotiations, but again, I'm speaking the real peace process built from bottom up. And what I hope that the new administration also will do the serious efforts to support building civil society on Palestinian side.
Right. Gil?
So in that spirit, I think there are two phrases that really need to be banished from the vocabulary when we talk about the next administration. First of all, anti-normalization. We have to make the case, and we have not made the case effectively, that the Palestinian strategy of anti-normalization is anti-peace. That the anti-normalization is saying that there can't be even the most benign contacts between your most lovely left-wing artist who wants you to sing Kumbaya and a Palestinian, because somehow that breaks the boycott. And what we're seeing, as Natan is saying, in Bahrain, with the UAE, is the opposite. I can't tell you the excitement that we're feeling now in the streets of Jerusalem about the business opportunities, the cultural opportunities, the academic opportunities, the opportunities to have this bottom-up experience of that's true peace. So first of all, and it's on our college campuses, but also in the halls of government, the Palestinians have to be told that if you are taking an anti-normalization line, you are actually putting huge obstacles in the way of peace and making peace all but impossible. That's number one. Number two is I think it's very important that critics, and inevitably there will be some critics of Biden's policy on the Middle East from the pro-Israel side, stop using this phrase anti-Israel for someone like Joe Biden, who has a half-century record of support for Israel. I have no desire, having really experienced the ugliness of anti-Israel forces at McGill University and elsewhere, having seen how harsh they are, how they deny our very right to be a people and define ourselves, our very right to assert our claim and our love of our land, our very right to have a state. When we use this phrase, for anyone who might happen to break from our particular vision of how to approach the peace process, we shoot ourselves in the foot. I do not want to recruit Joe Biden or anybody else to the forces of anti-Israelism. So that's the second idea that we have to really emphasize. But a third phrase that I would love to also exile is this notion of the peace process. And I think this is the real fear that some of us have about the Biden administration. That I understand that, first of all, of course, the big priority for Joe Biden and for the American people is solving the COVID crisis, solving the economic crisis. But to the extent that that means that the Middle East issue is left to the same old peace processors from Oslo, who never even acknowledged the failure of Oslo, who also haven't been willing to work into the fact that as much as they might hate Donald Trump, there's been a number of breakthroughs, especially this Abraham Accord. And if you cannot learn those lessons and incorporate them into your worldview, you're not just letting the Jewish people down. You're not just letting Israel down. You're letting the American people down. And we have to start from a new hymnal. And really, I say hymnal because it really has been a part of theology where we ignore reality and just a set of beliefs. And it's really important that the Biden administration show not only on the Middle East issue, but that despite the fact that he's now 78 years old, that Joe Biden is a forward thinker, is an out-of-the-box thinker. And this is a perfect opportunity for him to show that I'm going to, while critiquing Donald Trump every which way, this is one thing I might learn from the Trump administration and come up with a new synthesis, a new approach. But to the extent that we have the same old staffers who have made the same old mistakes and haven't learned anything, we'll really be in trouble.
Right. It's become a religion, as you said, to many of the peace processor ilk. And I don't think, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. They don't really want to acknowledge the strength of the Abraham Accords because it didn't run through Ramallah. They said it sidelined the Palestinians. But of course, where's the agency on the Palestinians' part for rejecting so many generous offers? Anyway, so so if you were to have any advice for the incoming administration, to the incoming of Joe Biden, what would you advise them?
Well, Gil, you are special presidents. You wrote 9 books on presidents. Now it's your 10th one. Okay.
So again, I would start by saying, think out of the box. I understand that when Barack Obama came in, it was very important for him to be the un-Bush. And when Donald Trump came in, it was very important for him to be the un-Obama. And I understand that dynamic and the need to kind of put your personal brand on the presidency. But it's also really important to flow and to learn what you can from the successes of the previous administration, not just the failures and shortcomings. So that would be the first process. And look, just to sharpen the point on these peace processors, a few weeks ago, Saeb Erekat died in a Jerusalem hospital, in Hadassah Hospital, of COVID. Something that he and his Palestinian leaders didn't want other Palestinians to do, which is go into a Jewish hospital, a Zionist hospital. Of course, he not only insisted on being in the hospital, but was in the VIP suite, because you don't get petty when it comes to saving human lives. And in Haaretz, 7 of these peace processors, positioning themselves clearly for a job in the Biden administration, wrote a eulogy about what a wonderful man Saeb Erekat was, and how he was one of the people who really truly understood peace. And they had 5 words that acknowledged that sometimes he could be too stubborn. But at no point in that editorial, in that op-ed, did they acknowledge that he was one of the people who had really hurt the Jewish people with the new blood libel in 2002 of claiming there was a Jenin massacre, claiming that there were 500 dead bodies, of mostly civilians, when there were 57 mostly of Palestinian fighters. And again, precisely because he was so charming, precisely because he had this lovely academic background, precisely because he could talk of peace on CNN and elsewhere in the American media, he was the man to go to pass these lies. And if we can't start with what Ben-Dror Yamini calls the industry of lies and shutting that down, if we can't start with also a little bit of complexity, acknowledgement of complexity, and if we can't break out of the simplicities, the black and white simplicities that have become also part of this religion of the peace processors, we're in trouble. And again, I'm not going to blame the Biden administration for these 7 people, but what dismayed me was their reading of the Biden administration was this would work. This would show, yeah, we're reaching out to the Palestinians. And we should also emphasize the difference between the Palestinians and Palestinian leaders. That it's the Palestinian leaders, the Palestinian dictators, the Palestinian kleptocrats, the Palestinian terrorists who have not only attacked Israel and Jews and innocents all over the world, but they have been the ones who, since the Oslo, let's call it, opportunity began, where they could have built, as Natan was saying, civil society, instead chose to impose a dictatorship on their people. And the ones who have most suffered at the hands of the Palestinian leaders have been the Palestinian people. And to the extent that we can change the dynamic and start talking about quality of Palestinian life and stop creating these keeping these refugee camps going, and stop creating these situations where Palestinians themselves don't have their quality of life front and center, we're not going to have progress and peace.
That's exactly right.
Well, I want to add one example. President Bush, some of his things were controversial, some of things were very successful, but he met with more than 100 democratic dissidents from different countries, from the countries which were enemies of the United States of America, and the countries who were dear friends of the United States of America. Nevertheless, he believed in the power of desire of people to be free. He spoke to me many times about it, and he was always interested to meet with democratic dissidents. When we had a conference in Prague and I invited him, people in the White House said, only one person in the White House would think that he should go and speak to dissidents, but he happens to be himself. But usually politicians are afraid, who knows what these dissidents will say publicly, will accuse him and so on. So when President Obama was elected, I wrote an article that probably in everything, President Obama would try to change things and to do opposite to President Bush. But I hope that in one area, he naturally will continue, for President Obama to continue meeting with democratic dissidents. It wasn't the case, unfortunately. He stopped this practice. Then came President Trump. I wrote that, of course, President Trump will be very different from President Obama, but I hope that he will be different and will resume meeting with dissidents. If there is one thing in which President Trump continued the policy of President Obama, not to meet with democratic dissidents, not to have a constant dialogue with them. So now again, there is a lot of conversation about human rights. Unfortunately, human rights was somehow hijacked from the course of real human rights, but there are a lot of people in this administration who really believe that it is important. So I do hope that President Biden now will return to that practice, which was established by President George Bush, regularly, systematically, to meet with democratic dissidents and coming even to friendly countries, not only speak in general about democracy, but in very specific terms, what is happening with democracy in this country.
Would you make a distinction between dissidents, for example, in Egypt that want the Muslim Brotherhood? They want to overthrow Sisi, and they feel that their religious freedom and their human rights have been taken away. A lot of them are imprisoned. Would you make a distinction in that case?
No, well, I emphasize a number of times democratic dissidents, meaning that it's people who are fighting for civil society, for human rights.
Right.
But if you'll take Sisi, of course, Sisi is a dictator.
Right.
He is putting all the dissidents in prison, those like Muslim Brothers who are non-democratic themselves, and those can be democratic opposition. And by the way, that's why I always saying, well, I understand why he is important ally, but at some moment also Stalin was important ally of the free world. But forget that as a dictator, he will be hated by his people. And the day will come when this dictatorship will finish. So don't have illusion, or don't be in the situation when you'll be supporting dictator against the will of these people. So yes, Muslim Brothers is fundamentalist and very often terrorist organization, very dangerous. But it doesn't mean that Sisi is enlightened dictator, because he puts in prison every opposition, democratic and non-democratic.
And if I can add something from the book, from Never Alone, where you really see the power of the president on this question of dissidents and human rights. It's 1977. Natan Sharansky, at the time Anatoly Sharansky, is accused falsely of spying for the United States. And that comes with a potential death penalty. There's a new president, Jimmy Carter, and he's told that everybody knows that in Washington, there's a sort of game. You never comment on an accusation of treason, spying, when it comes to the Soviet Union, because if you say, no, this guy isn't guilty, then you might imply that others are. And that's you know, everybody on the call knows Washington. That's one of the things you understand that's absolutely true. Well, thanks to Natan's and wife, Avital, who is now reaching out and pushing this tremendous campaign to free him almost from the start of his imprisonment. There's a crackerjack legal team, which includes Erwin Kotler, the legendary Canadian human rights activist, and Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz turns to a former student of his, Stu Eisenstadt, who now is a key advisor to Jimmy Carter. And thanks to Stu Eisenstadt, Jimmy Carter breaks Washington protocol. And he says, just a line and a half in a press conference, Anatoly Sharansky is not guilty of being a spy for the United States. And you know what? That helped save Natan Sharansky's life. So that's an example, a very specific example of the kind of symbolic leadership. And it didn't cost the United States a thing. The Soviet Union and the United States continue to play their Cold War game. And I think it's helpful sometimes to go back to these incidents in history where you see a moment that somebody stood up and did the moral thing and it made a difference.
Right, Right. So easy. All right. Sarah Leah is our Director of Communications, and she is going to read the questions that have come in, and I apologize if we can't get to all of them. Go ahead, Sarah Leah.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our panelists for all of your insights. We're very grateful to have you here today. And as Sarah mentioned, thank you to our audience who have submitted so many questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in the remaining 15 minutes. So the first question we have, there's a common impression among many that Israel directly works against democracy by supporting Arab autocracies. How can we change such an impression? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, no doubt that record of Israel in dealing with dictators is not perfect, but I think it can be improved. But at the same time, we have to remember that Israel is not simply living among the dictatorships. It lives in the world where there is permanent attempt to destroy it. And if the Western world had to accept the support or to be ally with Joseph Stalin fighting Hitler, no doubt that Israel at this moment needs support or cooperation with Egypt, which is ready to fight Hamas, for example. So I can understand what makes our government to coordinate many of our efforts with Egypt, but it doesn't mean that we in any way have to express any sympathy or support to the policy of President of Egypt putting all the dissidents, the democratic dissidents included, in prison. So it's a very thin line, but yes, we have to make it clear. If we have to cooperate with non-democratic regime, why we are doing it, on what conditions, and why we're not going to strengthen this regime in fighting its own dissent. Gil, you want to add something?
First of all, you see, we come from two very different worlds. And we argued again and again about all kinds of things in the writing of the book. Pacing, style, logic. Ideologically, we're really on the same page. We've never had an ideological disagreement. And it's quite extraordinary, and it's part of the theme of Never Alone, the connectedness and the fact that we have this broader platform. So indeed, look, if Israel decides we're only going to make peace with democracies, then it's going to be an even longer path to peace. And you know, it's very funny. I'm struck by the hypocrisy of those who kept on preaching to Israel for 20 years. Well, of course, you have to deal with the Palestinians before they have civil society, because you make peace with your enemy. And now all of a sudden that Israel has started reaching out to Bahrain and UAE through the Abraham Accords and vice versa, all of a sudden people are saying, how dare you deal with these dictators? We need a little bit of consistency here. If you truly believe in peace now, then what you do is you say any opportunity for peace. You think of it as kind of like this pile of goodness versus a pile of evil. And the more you can reduce the pile of evil, the pile of war, and add to the pile of goodness, the pile of peace, the better off we are. And we see how catchy it is. We see how it really can be, let's use a modern phrase, it can become a positive pandemic, right? Where we really can start seeing, if more and more Arabs start saying, hey, wait a minute, look what's going on between the UAE and Israel. Look at the business, look at the culture, look at the ties. Wow, hopefully it'll be catchy.
Great.
Thank you. And the next question, on the similarity between the Soviet doublethink and American college campuses, do you have any recommendations of how to rescue college campuses from doublethink?
Well, first of all, my recommendation is that every person has to choose for herself or himself, whether to live as a slave or a prisoner, or to live as a free person. I know from my own experience, you can be a free person in prison, and you can be really a Soviet slave in the most prestigious scientific institutions. If you are putting self-censorship, if you don't permit yourself to express your views, you're undermining your own freedom, but you also contribute to the society to be less free. So first of all, I would say it's very personal. Now it's not your life, or even your imprisonment is a question. Now it is your personal decision whether America will be more free country or less free country, because nobody really threatens you to hide your views.
Let me take it from the general college perspective and from the Jewish perspective. From the general college perspective, we need a consumer revolution on the campuses. We have parents who are paying $75,000 a year in the elite universities to have their children propagandized. We have parents, we have alumni, we have administrators who have turned into sheep. The power of the prestige, the power of this, what's called the military-industrial complex. This is the, university prestige complex. People are so afraid to take on Harvard and take on Yale and take on Tufts and take on Brandeis. And so instead, they happily write the check. They also have, especially in the upper middle classes, have made the university this object of worship. And so our kids come unprotected and think this is the most important place in the world and we cannot critique. And that's why I use phrases like academic malpractice, because that's not about Israel, it's not about Zionism, it's about abuse of the classroom. And it's about a professoriate that has used its prerogatives and its powers to really hijack the goal of the university. So I think there's a conversation that has to take place there. And secondly, on the Jewish side, two quick thoughts. One is everybody's always yelling, what about the students? And I say, what about the parents? Have the parents really raised the kids to come to the university with what I call Pilates, a strengthened core, a strong sense, if you have a strong sense of Jewish identity, if you have a strong sense of Zionist identity, if you have a strong sense of pride, you will not be bullied. You might occasionally, play the game because you need to, because I always tell my students, you don't need to look at every single challenge as an opportunity for you to prove your courage, right? You want to get by, but you'll at least have the sense of, I'm not gonna let them twist me around. So it starts with the parents, and indeed, as Natan said, it has to continue with the students. If you're not even willing, when you're paying $75,000 a year to stand up for yourself, if you're not really willing to understand that core linkage between identity and freedom, that freedom opens the door, but identity gives you the roadmap, the GPS. And if you're willing so quickly to turn away from your people, from your heritage, from your values, what, to get the A? Who are you? And then when you get into the real world, as we call it, and the pressures are coming from the bosses, and the pressures are coming from the harriedness of your life, then you're already lost. You've already lost your soul.
Right. I've heard from parents who've said to me, I raised my kids really well. They went to Hebrew school, they had a bar mitzvah, and now they say Zionism is awful. They're coming back from school, and the parents say, I gave them these books to read, and they say, who are you? You're just my mom. You're just my dad. These are the experts that you're paying $75,000 a year for us to learn from. So it's a very, very, I agree with you. You've got to strengthen the core. I love your analogy of Pilates, but it's very, very horrible out there when they have people like Leila Khalid of TWA hijacking note, who has no academic credentials whatsoever, as a guest lecturer at San Francisco State. We realize how awful things have descended to. Anyway, all right, Sarleya, next question.
Sure, thank you. The next question we have is pretty broad, so whatever thoughts you have on it. It seems that Israeli Jews and American Jews are growing apart. Is there any hope?
Well, all our book is about it. We speak a lot about it from very different directions. And I'll say why there is hope. In the middle of the most serious crises, for example, when we describe in details this double crisis, when on the one hand, the negotiations about Kotel agreement, which negotiation that I organized and led for 4 years on the request of Prime Minister, finished with the fiasco because Prime Minister was afraid that his coalition will fall apart. And serious accusations on this side of some leaders of diaspora that Israel betrayed them. And at that same time, there was Benjamin Netanyahu felt that on the question of Iran, where all the left and right in Israel, all the specialists in Israel agreed that that was the biggest danger for security of Israel, American Jews preferred to support the position of their president, who felt differently. And prime minister said, well, these people really are betraying us. They love Israel, which exists in their head, not in the real life, Israel which has to fight. So at that moment, nevertheless, when I was pushing government, but do you want that Israel will be place for all the Jews in the world? They said, of course we want. And when I pushed Jews of diaspora, do you know better tool to strengthen the identity of your children than the state of Israel itself? Well, they say, of course we don't know. And everybody wants that we will, as one family, will continue our journey together. And that means that we have all the time to remember that though we have different sets of priorities, because we chose different way of life. Half of us chose to live in the Middle East, in the Jewish state, among all these dictatorships. And half of us chose to live as a Jewish minority in the liberal society. And we want, for us, top priority is defending Israel. For you, top priority is keeping your society liberal. But the moment you start thinking above these disagreements, which are legitimate, and start understanding their nature, you will remember that there is something which unites us much more. It's our desire that in hundreds of years of my children and your children will continue to belong to one people. So yes, there is not only hope, I'm optimistic about future, but all of us for this must make a big effort to listen to one another. Gil?
Both David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir said you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist, and we're both Zionists, so we're perennial optimists, as you can hear. But it goes deeper. You know, in the same way when we talk about the universities, we also have to point out that not every university is San Francisco State. Not every university is a hot point. It's also true that while there are certain, we use the language of divergence and convergence. There are certain points of divergence. There are also lots of points of convergence. Just today, I saw on the forward, there's a new study that's come out about birthright that talks about 20 years into it, because Birthright now has data going back to when it was first launched.
Yeah.
20 years into Birthright's existence, you see the impact on Jewish identity and specifically on support for Israel from those people who had a 10-day gift. Now, first of all, that shows that simply, if it only takes a 10-day gift to really make that kind of a change, maybe we have to think educationally about how to deepen and go further, because Birthright is really like a last minute, a last gasp. But it shows that there are also trends that show that, 20 years ago, less than 20% of the American Jewish community at any point in their lives would have visited Israel. Now, before COVID, it was up to 50%. So we see the negative, but we also see the positive. We saw all the, identity building initiatives that Natan was a part of in the Jewish Agency. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we usually started the conversation about Israel with a guilt trip. If you don't defend the Jewish people, then there's something wrong with you. Now we start it with the opportunity. Come, be a captain of your Jewish journey. And here's a key part of that Jewish journey. So a lot of it also has to be how we choose to frame it and how we choose to approach it.
Great. It's wonderful to end on that very, very positive note. I really cannot thank you enough. In fact, I want to follow up with you because there's a lot of issues having to do with education in the United States and the funding of by Qatar and others. Qatar spent $30 million to fund public schools and for Arabic language. And I'd like to work with ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, about how we could develop an alternative curriculum.
Okay.
And so I'd love also, I can't thank you enough, and I'm honored that you chose to be on our webinar today, and I'd love to follow up with you. I also want to make a plug. This is, I don't know, I think our 45th webinar since the COVID-19 pandemic began. And if you've been listening to our webinars, and if you know about what we do on Capitol Hill, we really, really need your support. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has hit some of our bigger donors, and this is the time, if you appreciate the work of EMET, of telling the truth about Israel and its central role in the Middle East, then I would really love for you. Tomorrow, it's Giving Tuesday. We do have a triple match. And thank you so, so much. Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Natan. It's an honor and privilege to have spent an hour with you.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
Thank you for all your good work and for your friendship of my family over these years. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay.